Gideon Varick walked through the burned-out streets of Haven Point, his boots crunching over cracked metal and ash. The city had once been a hub of human settlement, but years of war and corporate greed had left it broken and quiet, save for the occasional howl of a scavenger drone or the hiss of a ruptured pipeline. Smoke curled into the sky from distant ruins, painting the clouds a sickly orange. Gideon had seen worse, but today the air felt heavier, weighed down by the sense of something lost, something worth fighting for. He kept his hand on the strap of his pack, checking the supplies he had left. Food was running low. Fuel was almost gone. His last paycheck had been stolen by a fraudulent contractor months ago, and now his bank account was empty. Still, he had one thing no one else could take: determination. Even in a world that had forgotten mercy, he could choose to act. A faint signal pinged on his portable tracker, a small device he had patched together from old military scraps. It was weak, almost indistinguishable amid the interference, but he recognized it immediately. Dragon hatchlings. The creatures were rare, almost extinct, and these signals came from abandoned nests. Other humans ignored them or sold them to corporations for profit, leaving the young dragons to die. But not Gideon. His pulse quickened. The faint cry carried over the static, small and fragile, and something deep in his chest twisted with both fear and hope. He hurried through a narrow alleyway, ducking under a fallen sign that swung precariously above the rubble. Every step was tense. Scavenger drones lurked in the shadows, programmed to attack anything living. Gideon kept low, moving with careful precision. His combat training told him where to place his weight, how to time his steps to avoid the drone sensors, and he used every skill he had honed over decades of fighting on battlefields across multiple worlds. This was not a fight he wanted, but one he could not avoid. The lives of innocent creatures were at stake. Reaching the edge of Haven Point, he climbed onto the roof of a crumbling building. From there he could see the crater where the signals were strongest. It was a dangerous place, a canyon carved by centuries of erosion and chemical storms. The ground was jagged, sharp rock jutting like broken teeth. Any misstep could snap a leg or worse, trap him miles from safety. But Gideon did not hesitate. He had faced impossible odds before. This was no different, except these stakes were more personal. As he descended toward the crater, the wind picked up, carrying with it the metallic tang of old machinery and scorched earth. His shuttle, a battered cargo craft patched with scavenged parts, sat waiting on a rocky ledge. Its hull was dented and scarred, much like its owner. Gideon ran his hand along the surface, checking the seals and fuel lines. There wasn't enough fuel for a long trip, barely enough to reach the hatchlings and return. Every decision from here on out mattered. He could fail, and if he did, the creatures would die, and so would his chance to do something meaningful in a life that had been mostly survival and loss. The signal blipped stronger now, guiding him like a beacon through the rocky terrain. Suddenly, a shadow flicked across the canyon wall, a scavenger drone, larger and faster than the usual ones. It hovered, scanning for movement. Gideon froze, timing his breathing. He waited for it to move away, then darted forward, sliding down a narrow ledge. A rock tumbled, clattering loudly. The drone pivoted instantly, its sensors locking on him. Without hesitation, Gideon grabbed a nearby scrap pipe and hurled it, hitting the drone's lens. Sparks flew and the machine reeled back. He sprinted the last few meters, heart hammering, adrenaline surging, lungs burning. At last he reached the edge of the crater. The faint cries were louder now, more desperate. Peering over the jagged rocks, he saw them. 3 tiny dragon hatchlings, trembling and weak, their scales dull and lifeless. One tried to push itself forward, but its legs buckled. Another whimpered pitifully, wings too fragile to spread. Gideon's chest ached. His eyes burned, not from dust or smoke, but from emotion he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Hope. Responsibility. He knelt down carefully, whispering to them in a low, steady voice, calming them with tones they could somehow recognize as safe. He knew he had to act fast. Storm clouds were building overhead, carrying acid rain that could corrode their fragile wings in minutes. The shuttle wasn't far, but the path was treacherous. Every step would be dangerous. And above all, he wasn't alone. Somewhere nearby, other scavengers might be watching, waiting for a chance to claim the dragons for themselves. Gideon glanced back at the path he had taken, calculating how he could maneuver both the hatchlings and his craft through the canyon before the storm hit. A hiss of wind and distant thunder rattled the rocks. Gideon's jaw tightened. The moment of truth was coming. He had no margin for error. He was about to risk everything: his life, his last fuel, his last supplies, for creatures others deemed worthless. But that was exactly why he had to act. With a deep breath, he reached down, scooping the first fragile hatchling into his arms. Its tiny claws dug lightly into his sleeve. The cries of the others rose in chorus, echoing off the canyon walls. Gideon's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed danger, yet he felt a spark of something brighter: human courage, a stubborn refusal to let the weak perish while he could do something. He stood, the wind tugging at his coat, the storm clouds pressing closer. Ahead lay the shuttle, the hatchlings, and a chance to defy fate itself. One wrong move and it would all be over. But Gideon took a step forward and then another, setting the first in motion toward a path that might just save them all. And as he moved, a shadow passed across the canyon, larger than any drone. Something alive, something dangerous was watching. Gideon froze, pulse spiking. This journey would not be simple. The hatchlings were not the only lives at risk. And for the first time he realized that surviving Erinder required more than courage. It required every ounce of his intelligence, experience, and resolve. The storm was coming, the hatchlings were waiting, and the real challenge had just begun. Gideon clutched the first hatchling to his chest and began moving toward the shuttle, stepping carefully over jagged rocks. The canyon floor was uneven, each step a test of balance. He could feel the wind pushing against him, tugging at his coat and threatening to unseat him. The hatchling whimpered but nestled closer, its tiny claws clinging to his sleeve. He glanced at the other two hatchlings trembling on the rocks below. Time was slipping. Storm clouds loomed overhead, dark and heavy, their edges glowing with distant lightning. Acid rain would reach them in minutes if he didn't act fast. Gideon crouched and whispered, "I'm coming. Hold on." He inched closer, scanning for loose rocks that might slide under his weight. His heart pounded, not from exhaustion but from fear. If one misstep toppled him, it wouldn't just be him in danger. The hatchlings could be crushed, their fragile lives snuffed out before they even had a chance. Human instinct screamed caution, but experience screamed speed. He had no choice but to move carefully and quickly at the same time. Reaching the second hatchling, he scooped it into the crook of his arm. It tried to nuzzle against him, small wings quivering. He felt a pang of hope mixed with worry. These creatures, abandoned by every other human, were now entirely dependent on him. Every decision he made from this point on would be a test of judgment, courage, and improvisation. He had survived wars, ambushes, and deadly storms, but nothing mattered more than this fragile cargo in his arms. The third hatchling struggled, its tiny legs shaking. Gideon approached slowly, speaking softly, letting it recognize him as a protector rather than a predator. It hesitated, then scrambled toward him with surprising determination, as if sensing he was their only chance. He caught it just before it fell into a narrow chasm, the rocks below jagged enough to pierce even the thickest hide. Relief washed over him, but it was brief. The sky above rumbled ominously. The storm was closer now. Acid droplets hissed as they hit the rocks. Gideon didn't waste a second. He adjusted his pack and began the climb to the shuttle, carrying two hatchlings in one arm and cradling the third carefully. The rocks were sharp and unstable. Every slip could be fatal. Halfway up, a sudden gust of wind slammed him sideways. He pressed himself against the cliff, holding the hatchlings close. One of them let out a small shriek, trembling violently. Gideon whispered a promise he hoped they could understand. "You'll live. I won't let anything happen to you." The words steadied him more than the hatchlings. They reminded him why he was risking everything. At last he reached a ledge that would take him to the shuttle. The craft was battered, patched with scrap metal and salvaged circuits, but it was the only hope for survival. He climbed the final few meters, muscles screaming in protest. The hatchlings struggled to hold on to him, tiny claws digging into his sleeves, wings flapping weakly. He reached the shuttle's ramp and set them down carefully, checking that the doors still sealed properly. Fuel was low, life support systems were fragile, but it would have to do. Gideon moved quickly inside, securing the hatchlings in the small containment pods he had built. They were crude, just enough to shield the dragons from falling debris and stabilize their fragile bodies. He monitored their vitals, watching the tiny rises and falls of their chests. Their lives were almost entirely in his hands. A bead of sweat slid down his temple, mixing with dirt and ash, but he didn't wipe it away. There was no time for comfort. Then came the sound, a mechanical hum, low and menacing. Gideon froze. Outside the canyon, scavenger drones were closing in, drawn by the same weak dragon signals that had guided him. These were no ordinary drones. They were larger, faster, and built to capture or destroy. If they detected the shuttle, they could rip it apart before he even lifted off. He felt a surge of fear, but it was accompanied by clarity. Panic could kill the hatchlings faster than any storm. Strategy was the only way out. Gideon darted to the control panel, running calculations in his head faster than the machines could scan him. He rerouted power from non-essential systems to the engines, overloading circuits with careful precision. Sparks flew and a warning beeped, but the engines roared to life. He needed altitude, but he also needed distraction. Looking around, he grabbed a few of the empty cargo crates and set them on the ramp, connecting them to an old drone emitter. When launched, they would mimic the hatchlings' cries, drawing the scavengers' attention. The first crate ejected, spinning through the canyon, emitting high-pitched, desperate sounds. One of the drones veered immediately, giving Gideon the opening he needed. He slammed the shuttle into motion, dodging jagged rocks as he ascended. Acid rain pelted the hull, sizzling on contact, but he ignored the burning in his hands and arms. The hatchlings shrieked in alarm, but he pressed forward, speaking softly to calm them. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the canyon walls in jagged flashes. The scavenger drones pursued the decoys, but Gideon had anticipated their patterns, calculated the turbulence, and threaded the shuttle through the narrowest passage. Sparks flew as the hull scraped rock in several places, but he maintained control, pushing both himself and the hatchlings to the limit. Finally, through sheer force of will, experience, and human ingenuity, the canyon opened up into a clearer sky. The drones were momentarily confused, diverted by the false signals. Gideon exhaled, sweat and ash streaking his face. The storm had not yet passed, but he had bought a chance, a narrow, precious chance, to carry the hatchlings to safety. He looked down at the pods, the tiny dragons nestled inside, trembling but alive. A smile broke across his face, faint but real. He had survived the canyon, outsmarted the drones, and kept the hatchlings safe so far. But the real danger was not over. The sanctuary was still far, the storm still approaching, and Erinder had a way of testing humans when they dared to act. Gideon gripped the controls tighter. "Hold on," he whispered. "We're not done yet." Above the canyon, dark clouds churned and lightning struck closer, sending a hiss of electricity across the shuttle's hull. Below, the canyon yawned like a waiting trap. And somewhere, watching silently, something larger than any drone stirred, something alive, intelligent, and dangerous. Gideon's jaw tightened. The hatchlings were counting on him. And he would not fail. The shuttle soared through the stormy sky, engines straining as Gideon scanned the horizon. Acid rain pelted the hull, sizzling with every impact. The hatchlings whimpered softly in their pods, wings shivering, tiny hearts beating faster than human senses could measure. He had bought them a brief safety, but the canyon's narrow escape had drawn attention. Something bigger was coming. A shadow appeared on the sensors. Not a drone. Something larger. Sleek, fast, and deadly. Gideon's pulse jumped. The corporate recovery ship glinted in the storm, engines burning bright against the dark clouds. Their intentions were clear. They wanted the dragons. Every calculation, every maneuver he had made to save the hatchlings had alerted them. And now they were closing in, weapons locked. Gideon's mind raced. Fighting them head-on was suicide. His shuttle was patched together from salvaged parts, barely fueled and built for cargo, not combat. He would be destroyed in seconds. But humans had a talent for turning the impossible into survival. He had to think faster than the enemy. He scanned the shuttle for anything he could use, anything at all. A grin broke across his face, brief but sharp. He reached for the auxiliary drone emitter. The crates he had used as decoys in the canyon flashed in his mind. They had worked once. They could work again, but this time the stakes were higher. He opened the cargo bay and connected the pods to the emitter. Then, with precise timing, he activated the system. False signals burst into the stormy sky, emitting high-pitched dragon cries. The corporate ship veered instantly, drawn toward the decoys. Gideon didn't wait. He pushed the shuttle harder, threading it through a labyrinth of clouds and lightning, dodging the storm's acid lashes. Every second counted, every decision mattered. He calculated wind currents, turbulence, and the shifting weight of the hatchlings, adjusting thrusters manually. Sparks flew from the engines and the hull groaned under pressure. One misstep could tear the shuttle apart. The first hatchling shrieked in fear, wings flapping wildly. Gideon spoke softly, his voice low but steady. "It's okay. We're almost through. Just hold on." The tiny creature pressed against him instinctively, trusting him even though it had no reason to. That trust fueled his resolve. Humans had always been at their best when the weak counted on them, when survival required not just strength but clevernesss. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the storm in jagged flashes. A drone swooped out of the clouds, weapon ports glowing. Gideon fired a flare, bright and blinding, forcing it to veer off. Sparks rained down as the metal scraped the hull, but he maintained control. Another drone appeared, faster and smarter than the last. He dropped another decoy, sending it spinning toward the enemy, mimicking the hatchling's cries. The drones followed it instantly, leaving the shuttle unscathed. Even as he maneuvered, Gideon thought ahead. The sanctuary was not far, but the storm would intensify before they could arrive. He needed a landing point that could shield them from acid rain and lightning strikes, something the corporate ship wouldn't anticipate. He scanned the terrain and found a rocky outcrop partially hidden by dense storm clouds. It would be risky, a steep drop and jagged cliffs, but it was their only chance. He activated the shuttle's emergency thrusters, banking sharply toward the outcrop. The hatchlings shrieked in unison, wings flapping weakly. Gideon's hands were steady, heart hammering in rhythm with the engines. He used every ounce of human skill, every lesson learned in combat and survival, to navigate the shuttle through narrow corridors of wind and lightning. Sparks flew from the hull as it scraped against jagged rocks, but he held steady. One slip and it would all be over. Then a sudden impact rocked the shuttle. One of the pods slid violently. Gideon lunged, catching it just before it toppled. The hatchlings cried, small voices of fear and confusion, but he steadied them quickly. "You're safe," he whispered, even though he wasn't entirely sure. Every word was a promise he had to keep. The corporate ship recalculated, realizing the decoys were false. Its weapons tracked the shuttle's heat signature, closing in fast. Gideon's mind raced. There was no room for error. He remembered the canyon trick. The sudden gusts, the turbulence, the way he had used the environment to his advantage. He pushed the shuttle into a tight spiral, banking through the storm, forcing the enemy to slow down to avoid collision. Sparks flew from their pursuit ship as it struggled against wind currents, giving him precious seconds. Finally, the rocky outcrop loomed ahead. Gideon adjusted the thrusters, angling the shuttle for a rough but possible landing. Acid rain stung the windows and the hatchlings shrieked again, but he pressed forward. The hull scraped against jagged stones, metal groaning, but he guided the shuttle to a precarious resting point. Engines roared, then stuttered as they stabilized. He exhaled, feeling the tension drain slightly, but the danger was far from over. He checked the hatchlings. They were shaken, trembling but alive. Their eyes looked up at him, small, trusting, and for a moment he felt the weight of responsibility lift. The storm still raged above, and the corporate ship had not given up. But Gideon knew something fundamental about humans. When odds were impossible, ingenuity and courage could create a chance where none existed. Lightning flashed again, and for an instant the clouds seemed to part. He could see a path forward, a route that might carry them toward the sanctuary if he dared. But it would require every ounce of daring, every shred of skill, and more luck than he had ever known. Gideon tightened his grip on the controls. "This isn't over," he muttered. "Not yet. Hold on, little ones. We're going to make it." And somewhere in the storm, unseen eyes tracked them, larger, sharper, intelligent. The next test was waiting, and it would demand not just courage, but heroism beyond anything Gideon had faced before. The shuttle rested precariously on the rocky outcrop, its engines smoking and trembling under the stress of the storm. Gideon wiped the rain and ash from his face, staring at the jagged cliffs below. One wrong move and they could tumble into the canyon, crushed by rock and acid. The hatchlings huddled together in their pods, fragile and shivering. He could feel their tiny hearts beating faster, feeding off his own tension. Every instinct screamed that the danger was far from over. The sanctuary was close, hidden deep within the cliffs of Sanctum Ridge, a floating network of biodomes shielded by electromagnetic barriers. It was the only place that could protect the hatchlings from storms, predators, and human greed. But reaching it meant a leap across an open chasm, the last unstable canyon bridge standing between them and safety. The bridge was narrow, cracked, and slick with rain. Any attempt to cross it in the shuttle was high risk. Failure would mean death for all of them. Gideon leaned into the controls, calculating wind currents, shuttle weight, and turbulence. Every variable mattered. He could feel his hands shaking, but he didn't allow it to show. Fear was a luxury he could not afford. The hatchlings were counting on him, and human courage demanded he act where others would hesitate. Lightning split the sky above, illuminating the chasm. Sparks danced along the shuttle's hull, and the roar of the storm pressed in from all sides. Gideon set the shuttle into position, engines whining under the strain. He whispered softly to the hatchlings, "Hold on. I've got you. We're going to make this. His voice was steady, a promise he meant with every fiber of his being. He floored the engines, pushing the shuttle forward. The wind slammed against them, threatening to throw the craft off course. The hatchlings shrieked, tiny wings flapping in panic. Gideon adjusted the thrusters mid-flight, twisting the shuttle to align with the narrow path ahead. Sparks flew as the hull scraped against jagged stones, and a small panel burst into flames. He ignored it. Survival was all that mattered now. Halfway across, the shuttle lurched violently as a gust of wind hit them sideways. One hatchling slipped in its pod, claws digging into the edge. Gideon's heart pounded. He reached instinctively, catching it just before it tumbled out. The other two shrieked, frightened by the sudden motion. Almost there, he muttered, voice low but commanding, a rhythm that calmed them even amid chaos. The bridge narrowed even further. Below, the canyon stretched deep and dark, a death trap of jagged rock and acid pools. Gideon gritted his teeth and pushed harder, banking the shuttle with precision. Every calculation, every muscle memory from decades of combat, every lesson learned from surviving hostile worlds now guided his hands. He was humanity's cleverness and determination in motion, navigating impossibility with skill and courage. A blinding flash of lightning struck nearby, momentarily disorienting him. The shuttle wobbled dangerously. Gideon gritted his teeth and corrected, thrusters screaming, guiding the craft in a delicate dance over the bridge. Sparks sprayed from the edges, metal groaning under the strain. The hatchlings shrieked again, tiny cries that fueled his determination. They had survived so far and they would survive this. He refused to fail. Finally, the other side loomed, the cliffs of Sanctum Ridge, biodomes glowing faintly through the storm, shields flickering with electromagnetic energy. Gideon adjusted the shuttle's pitch, angling for the safest landing zone. He pressed every control with deliberate force, throttling engines to compensate for wind and turbulence. The hatchlings trembled, but instinctively, they leaned toward his steady hands, trusting the human who had saved them. The shuttle slammed onto the cliff edge with a jolt, skidding slightly but remaining intact. Gideon exhaled, relief crashing through his body. The engines sputtered but held. Sparks danced from exposed circuits, but the worst was over. He immediately secured the hatchlings, moving them carefully from the pods into safer containment units designed for the sanctuary. Their eyes looked up at him, shining with a mixture of fear and trust, tiny wings fluttering with cautious life. From the storm above came the faint hum of pursuit, but Gideon didn't turn. His focus was on the hatchlings on the biodome ahead. Every second counted. The sanctuary's caretakers would arrive shortly to retrieve the dragons and provide the medical attention they desperately needed. For once he felt a rare sense of hope. Against impossible odds, his courage, intelligence, and determination had bought them this chance. Gideon slumped back in the shuttle, heart pounding, drenched in rain and sweat. He allowed himself a small smile, a quiet acknowledgement of what humans could achieve. One man with nothing but his wits, training, and last resources, had carried fragile life through fire, wind, and steel to safety. This was humanity at its finest, undaunted, ingenious, relentless, willing to risk everything for the weak and innocent. Lightning flashed one final time as the storm began to subside. Above the sanctuary, dragons stirred in their temporary holding cells, wings flexing, tiny bodies brimming with cautious strength. Gideon stood at the edge of the cliff, watching as caretakers arrived to guide them into safety. His heart swelled with a quiet pride. These creatures, abandoned and left for dead by others, had survived because of human courage. But even as he watched, he felt a tug of unease. Erinder was never truly safe. The corporate ship that had pursued them would return and new threats would rise. Yet he did not falter. He had learned long ago that humans thrived not because the odds were easy, but because they refused to be beaten by them. Every action, every choice, every act of bravery left a mark. Today the mark was life, 3 fragile lives preserved against a storm and hunters alike. Gideon exhaled deeply, watching the hatchlings disappear into the sanctuary's protective dome. Their cries faded into the wind, replaced by soft coos of curiosity and tentative safety. He knew the next challenge would come, but for now the impossible had been beaten. Human courage, ingenuity, and morality had carved a path where none existed. And that, he thought, was reason enough to survive. With a final glance at the glowing sanctuary and the stormy sky beyond, Gideon climbed back into the shuttle. The world was harsh, dangerous, and unforgiving, but humans could endure, could innovate, could protect, and could rise above. For the hatchlings, for those who could not save themselves, for humanity itself, He would do it again. The storm faded, but Gideon's resolve burned brighter than ever. The storm had passed, leaving Irinder's cliffs slick and glimmering under a pale, filtered sun. Gideon stood at the edge of Sanctum Ridge, watching the biodomes hum with energy. Inside, the hatchlings were moving, wings flexing and bodies trembling with cautious curiosity. Their cries had softened, replaced by small chirps of exploration, a sound that filled Gideon with a rare warmth. After everything, the storms, the scavengers, the near-death moments, life had survived. And that survival was because of him. Caretakers from the sanctuary approached, their uniforms smeared with rain and dirt, but their expressions were full of awe. They had heard of his daring rescue, though they hadn't seen the full stormy journey. One of them, a young woman named Leora, stepped forward and knelt by the pods. Her eyes widened as she inspected the hatchlings. These should be gone. No one else would have risked this. You saved them. Gideon shrugged, brushing rain from his coat. They're alive. That's enough. But even as he said it, he felt the weight of every decision, every risk he had taken. The last of his fuel, the patched-up shuttle, the calculated maneuvers over the canyon and through the storm, none of it mattered unless the hatchlings survived. And they had. Against impossible odds, life had been preserved. He moved closer to the edge, watching the horizon. The sanctuary domes were protected by electromagnetic shields that could withstand storms, predators, and even the worst of scavenger raids. These hatchlings, abandoned and weak, now had a chance to grow, to become strong, to survive where so many others would have perished. Gideon's chest swelled with a sense of quiet pride. He had risked everything, spent every last credit, and still, against a world that had turned cruel, he had made a difference. The hatchling's mother, a massive dragon with scales that shimmered like molten metal, arrived soon after. She had been tracked by the sanctuary and was wary at first, circling the cliffs, wings tense, eyes narrow. Gideon froze, unsure how she would react. In the past, adult dragons could be unpredictable, even hostile, especially toward humans. But as he stepped forward slowly, keeping his hands visible, he spoke softly. They're safe. I kept them alive. That's all I wanted. The dragon studied him, nostrils flaring, claws flexing. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she lowered her massive head toward the hatchlings, sniffing them. Their tiny bodies wriggled against the gentle breeze of her wings. She let out a low, rumbling hiss, not anger but acknowledgement. And then she nudged each hatchling carefully, confirming their safety. Gideon exhaled, tension melting. Humanity had earned trust here in a way words could not describe. Leora and the caretakers began transferring the hatchlings into the sanctuary, and Gideon stayed nearby, watching. Even with the storm behind them, danger on Irinder never fully disappeared. Corporate hunters would return, storms would rage again, predators lurked beyond the cliffs. But today they had won. Today he had proven that human courage, intelligence, and determination could make a difference where others had given up. A small crowd of other settlers began to gather, drawn by the news of the rescue. Some whispered admiration, some disbelief. He actually did it, one muttered. Against a storm, scavengers, everything, they looked to Gideon, a human who had acted when no one else would. He didn't need praise, but he felt something swell inside, a sense of connection, a reminder that humans could be extraordinary when they refused to bow to odds that seemed insurmountable. Gideon finally turned back to the horizon. The canyon, the broken bridges, the storm-ravaged cliffs, they were behind him. Ahead lay the sanctuary, the dragons, and the knowledge that his actions had changed the course of these lives. The hatchlings would grow, and one day they might soar through Irinder's skies, symbols of resilience. And somewhere in their memory, perhaps they would remember the human who had risked everything for them. He looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred, remnants of a life spent in conflict. They had created life instead of destruction today. That was the true victory. It wasn't the storm, the shuttle, or the canyon. It was the choice to act when the world had abandoned hope. That was human courage. That was human strength. The hatchlings chirped again, small and hopeful, and the mother dragon nudged them with protective precision. Gideon's eyes softened. He had no children of his own, no family waiting for him elsewhere. But here, among these tiny abandoned creatures, he felt something he had not felt in years: purpose. Every scar, every loss, every desperate gamble had led to this moment. He had given life a chance to endure, and in doing so, had proven that humanity could shine even when the odds were stacked impossibly against them. The sky began to clear, the storm clouds breaking to reveal pale sunlight over the cliffs. The sanctuary glimmered, and for the first time since he had arrived in Haven Point, Gideon allowed himself a deep, steady breath. The hatchlings were safe, the mother was watching over them, and he had survived. More than survival, he had triumphed. Not because of strength alone, but because of courage, intelligence, and relentless determination. Gideon stepped back from the cliff's edge, letting the wind dry his soaked coat. He would leave the sanctuary soon, returning to the wastelands he called home. But he carried a quiet knowledge that humans could make the impossible possible. That one person willing to risk everything could alter the fate of life itself. The hatchlings' cries echoed faintly from the sanctuary, mingling with the distant hum of the shields and the wind. It was a sound of life, of hope, and of a future yet unwritten. Gideon smiled faintly. Humanity had its flaws, its wars, its greed. But on this day, it had also its courage, its morality, and its triumph. And that, he knew, was enough.